It's a bit of a controversial opinion, but I believe Demon Slayer is a bit of a mess. Demon Slayer is far and away one of the most critically and commercially successful Japanese anime franchises ever. Certainly the biggest of the past decade, even matching up to the success of giants like Dragon Ball, Naruto, and One Piece. And I have nothing but respect for what Demon Slayer has accomplished in the years since its anime adaptation. One of the highest selling mangas, highest grossing film of 2020 in spite of the whole lockdown thing, still breaking records and maintaining its large following, even though it ended a good 5 years ago now. And I definitely see why it's so beloved. Very easy to understand storytelling, a strong emotional hook, likable characters, amazing, memorable character designs, and some spectacular, unique, and well-paced fight scenes. I can say whatever I want about this anime, it doesn't change the fact that Demon Slayer is a big deal, and I can't take that away from anyone. But I still find that I've always had a bit of trouble connecting with this series. I mean, I've always enjoyed what I saw of it. There's never been a moment where I thought what I was witnessing was outright bad, but I've never looked at it nearly as fondly as my favorite battle shonens, or even some of the more middle-of-the-road ones that aren't the best, but I still find myself engaged all the same. I'd like to chalk it all down to Demon Slayer simply not appealing to me, but personally, I truly believe Demon Slayer makes quite a number of mistakes in terms of how it presents its story that really keep me from really getting into it the way its mangaka must have intended. It's for that reason I feel Demon Slayer has only once successfully captivated me in ways other shonens do. Its 8th storyline, the Entertainment District arc. But I feel that raises the question, what makes this arc so special when compared to everything that surrounds it? Why does the vast majority of Demon Slayer's narrative not sit well with me, but this arc does? So, quick recap for the uninformed. Demon Slayer is a story about a young man named Kamado Tanjiro, who, after the slaughtering of all but one of his family members, strives to and eventually becomes a member of the Demon Slayer Corps, a organization that specializes in, well, demon slaying. That one family member who survived, by the way, is his younger sister, Nezuko, who despite surviving the attack which killed her family, was transformed into a demon. But unlike the majority of demons, she has no dangerous intentions, and as such, Tanjiro simultaneously aims to find some way to transform her back into a normal human. As such, Demon Slayer's narrative primarily follows Tanjiro's many encounters with demons while working with the Demon Slayer Corps. Particularly his encounters with the Upper Moons, the enforcers to the worst demon of them all, Michael Jackson. Well, actually, it's Muzan Kibu something, but I don't really care. I just like calling him Michael Jackson because he looks like him. It is a very straightforward, incredibly simplistic plotline that never tries to be anything more than it needs to be, and I think that's part of what has made it so successful, as that allows it to be easy to digest and easy to watch through. But I do feel it's that same element to its storytelling that also results in it not feeling as satisfying to watch as other shonen. I feel Demon Slayer, in that drive to be as straightforward as possible, is incredibly unwilling to go the extra mile to make its storytelling work even better. It takes the attitude of, why be great if it's perfectly fine just to be good? Take things such as the setting or the power system. Demon Slayer takes place somewhere around the early 1910s or the mid-1920s, the Taisho era to be exact. But when you really think about it, why does it take place in this time period? Demon Slayer doesn't really do anything with this era in history in particular aside from having more modern technology such as electricity, cars, and trains. And those elements are only really set dressing at the end of the day anyways, given most of Demon Slayer takes place in rural areas that don't have modern technology. Take that stuff away and Demon Slayer could have honestly taken place at any point between the Middle Ages to the 1930s and nothing would really change. And you have something like the power system. Unlike many of Demon Slayer's shonen contemporaries, it's very to the point. Some training, some breathing, and boom, your movements and attacks mirror water, fire, sun, sound, love, mist, etc. The power system and the setting both are things that the story doesn't really spend too much time engaging with. What you see is honestly what you get, and personally, I kinda wish Demon Slayer went further into these things. But at the same time, I am also under the impression that not only does this kind of stuff not entirely affect the overall quality of Demon Slayer, I actually think for some, especially in the case of the power system, this is part of the appeal. Compared to Jujutsu Kaisen, its insanely intricate cursed energy system, Demon Slayer's power system makes its fights easy to follow, more about the emotions of the action than the character's method of approaching the action. But this unwillingness to go harder with what material is there seeps to all parts of Demon Slayer's narrative, and I feel results in one that at times is clearly a bit messy. Take for example, how so much of Demon Slayer's arcs are just action, action, action. Arcs hardly have a moment to really begin before the characters are already fighting the climactic final battle. This isn't intrinsically an issue. Going back to Jujutsu Kaisen momentarily, by far its most beloved arc is the Shibuya incident, a large conflict between the main characters and several curses, where important characters are killed, characters grow, and the arc is like 99.5% action. But I also think there is a massive dividing line between the storytelling of Shibuya and the majority of Demon Slayer's story arcs. Shibuya is an arc that works because of everything that came before. Gojo and Geto's background, as well as Toji's motivations, are super integral to this arc. And both of these things had been showcased in extensive detail during the previous arc. One of the major character deaths is that of Nanami, and the emotional impact of this moment is based on his prior established relationship with Yuji during Season 1, similar situation with that of Nobara. So, what would happen if much of the context for Shibuya, from Nanami's relationship to Yuji to Geto and Gojo's past, what if all of that was dropped at different points in the middle of that arc? To me, that's what most Demon Slayer arcs feel like. Demon Slayer arcs have a terrible tendency to just jump straight into the action. And I don't mean just have the characters fight. Usually that means the moment the action starts, you are already in the climax of the arc, as that battle is going to take up the remainder of the story arc with few, if any, breaks in between. This is ultimately fair in the shorter arcs of Season 1, but as we get into longer arcs like Mount Natagumo, Mugen Train, say the entirety of Season 3, problems begin to emerge from this storytelling format. Something Demon Slayer likes to get across to its audience is that even though the demons Tanjiro and the other Demon Slayers face may be very objectively evil, many of them came from very sympathetic backgrounds, troubled childhood, bad families, unfortunate communities, etc. Things that ultimately led them down the path of becoming the demons they would later become, and often in their last moments, we see them contemplate their life decisions, and some are given the chance to redo these choices in a second life. That is an incredibly sweet sentiment, and an interesting approach to presenting its antagonists, reminding the audience that as evil as the demons are, many of them were both human and victims of circumstances. But Demon Slayer has a really bad habit of just shoving this information right as these demons are dying, never letting that detail ever be a factor in their characters at all before they are about to die. We spend episodes at a time watching these demons commit horrific crimes with little shred of inner conflict or nuance, only for the series to come to a screeching halt and shout at us to feel bad for them because they used to be poor. By all means, this feels emotionally manipulative. Like the narrative is brute forcing nuance and sympathy into a story where there wasn't any before. If Demon Slayer made either a passing attempt, or better yet, an attempt at all with some of these demons to really suggest some humanity was in these antagonists, this would be a much easier pill to swallow. And again, it really does not help that the story tries to unload all of this nuance at the very last minute more often than not. As is, the way this element to their characters is presented is at the very least acceptable. It's not outright bad, but it definitely doesn't make me feel the intended emotions I imagine the writer must have intended, because I'm too distracted by the arm of the writer very clearly guiding my emotions, when they very easily could have avoided putting their arm in there in the first place had they planned this story a bit better. If we, say, had hints of the pain and humanity that were there before the flashbacks in order to build to that. You know a series that manages that? Naruto. Its top 3 antagonists not named Orochimaru, because I know I'd get jumped if I ignored him, Pain, Tobi, and Madara, are antagonists where we're given their backstory somewhere in the middle of their involvement in the story. And our knowledge of their past, and importantly, how this is shown to affect their current motivations, is core to what makes these antagonists tick. Whether that be Pain's belief that the pain of loss is what drives understanding, therefore what he needs to inflict upon the world in order to bring it together, Tobi's trauma, as essentially a child soldier, driving him to want to create a dream world where not only is there no pain or suffering, but everyone gets to live in the exact world they desire, and ditto for Madara since he's got the same motivation, but their backgrounds play into their actions and are played with over the course of their time in the narrative. Contrast to Demon Slayer, where it could not be any more of an afterthought for most of these demons. Now, I personally don't believe Demon Slayer needs to explore its antagonists or their motivations to nearly the same extent as Naruto. I feel that would take away from the more simplistic appeal of Demon Slayer's narrative. But I do feel I and many audience members would be much more engaged and invested in these conflicts if there was more to these antagonists, if I was more aware of their backgrounds before the last minute, or if those backgrounds played a role in their actions. I mean, this was sort of the case with Rui, but it mostly just amounted to him abusing other demons and calling them his family, which, while a good start, nothing of interest was really done with that, just a hint that he might have some baggage. I can't help but pin this problem on how Demon Slayer is just so quick-paced. It often doesn't give us the opportunity to slow down and breathe, or really even properly build into these huge climaxes, as more often than not, the moment hostilities break out, that's all the remaining arc is going to be. And unlike, say, the Android or Frieza sagas in Dragon Ball Z, these aren't a series of related but ultimately separate on and off conflicts that permeate the entire arc. This is one enormous fight scene that doesn't end until the arc is over. So whereas the first half of those arcs give us some time to build the tension and threat of guys like Frieza, the androids, and Cell, Demon Slayer introduces them almost as soon as it's time to enter the climax. In Demon Slayer, that build can amount to maybe an episode or two. I also feel I should acknowledge that this sort of stuff isn't the only thing that makes for great antagonists, hell, even great characters. I've discussed this in other videos, such as my video discussing the homunculi in Full Metal Alchemist, or my video discussing antagonists in general from 2003 Full Metal Alchemist. But another element to writing your characters well is just making them, to put it simply, very fun characters to watch. Guys like Dio, whose actions are hammy and over the top, or Aizen, whose presence is mysterious and anxiety-driven. Demon Slayer antagonists, character-wise, tend to be a little bland, even the ones who I'll be praising very shortly, unfortunately. I do think the show has a couple up its sleeves who may prove to be interesting in the future, but we'll have to see. So just to reiterate my issue here, as a result of Demon Slayer's choice to jump straight into action almost the moment an arc begins, the series has a habit of dumping the antagonists' backstories right as they're dying, making any and all sympathy I'm supposed to have feel unearned. Unlike other shonen like Jujutsu Kaisen or Naruto, which plant character motivations and emotional stakes throughout their stories, Demon Slayer tries to retroactively insert depth. It's not that the show needs to be more complex, but it would benefit immensely from slowing down and fleshing out its antagonists earlier and letting its emotional beats breathe. Now, there is a very obvious workaround to the problem I pose here, and that's simply writing that into the action. Sure, there is less time to build up all the emotional weight, but it's certainly better than just dropping it all at the last minute. But with how much often goes on in these fight scenes, the insane set pieces, character strategies, etc., usually there just isn't enough time for that. And yet, the Entertainment District arc manages to create maybe not the greatest set of anime or even shonen antagonists out there, but for Demon Slayer standards, creates certainly the most standout and interesting set so far, while maintaining the very simple execution and style that I came to expect out of Demon Slayer. Daki, and later her brother Gyotaro, are built up and portrayed significantly better than any of the antagonists that came before, for a number of reasons, but it's no thanks to how Gotoge managed to characterize the both of them before hitting us with that commonplace end-of-arc demon flashback, that this time actually felt earned. Daki is a pretty straightforwardly evil character who treats people like trash because she totally can, but unlike a lot of other demons, she's much more volatile. Unlike previous demons who often appear dominant for much of the action, Daki spends a decent chunk of the arc losing. She gets emotionally rattled by Tanjiro's forehead form or Nezuko's Super Saiyan transformation, both of which put her power to shame, and it causes her to have an episode, especially when Uzui arrives and defeats her handily. Even if she is a total jerk, it is much easier to accept that in her past she wasn't always the drunk on power dickhead she would later become during her demon years, which makes the flashback that we eventually get much more effective. And I haven't even mentioned their older brother Gyotaro yet. His relationship with Daki really rounds him out perfectly, with their love-hate relationship being a huge factor in the conflict between them and the squad during the climax of the arc. The two constantly bicker, talk past each other, and blame one another when things fall apart, but all of that messiness only makes them feel more like real siblings, and this relationship of theirs is heavily contrasted with that of Tanjiro and Nezuko, who are another pair of siblings who fight right next to each other. And while there is a staggering list of differences between these pair that makes them feel very different, unlike, say, Naruto and Pain or Naruto and Tobi, where there are more similarities to indicate that they are two sides of the same coin, Daki and Gyotaro do not mirror, more so reflect and distort the relationship between our two protagonists, a fact that Tanjiro picks up on and contemplates as he battles the two, a fact that leads him, in their last moments, to beg them to get along, to stop shouting such terrible things at each other, because he, of all people, understood the importance of family, of lifting each other up, even when things weren't the best, and it's those words that help them reconcile even as they enter the gates of hell together. Daki and Gyotaro are far from the greatest anime antagonists, but I was much more engaged with the conflict involving them because despite both not having much time for introduction, especially in the case of Gyotaro, who literally just pulls up on everyone mid-fight, their personalities and light sympathetic qualities make them feel more involved than your average antagonist from Demon Slayer, especially up to this point. And so by the time we get the expected end-of-arc antagonist flashback moment, it felt earned. Another aspect of the Entertainment District arc that I think makes it stand out considerably better against the rest of the story is how it handles the heroes of the arc. This is a more personal antidote, albeit one I do feel is felt by most viewers, but Demon Slayer has some terribly polarizing characters. I saw a comment under a YouTube video where someone expressed that Demon Slayer characters do not have characteristics, they personify them. What they mean by that is that these characters feel like walking archetypes, with these basic personality traits being terribly overplayed in every single interaction they are in. I do feel there is some nuance to the discussion, like for some characters they turn out relatively fine, for others they can be unbearably plain with every interaction feeling like this one character trait of theirs on repeat with no nuance behind their characteristics. The idea here is that Demon Slayer characters often come off as not just bland, because that isn't intrinsically a bad thing, but monotonous, with repetitious, predictable characterization and interactions. I point this out to express that depending on who you are though, Demon Slayer characters are either some of the coolest, funnest anime characters you will ever see, or some of the lamest, most annoying or just boring characters you will ever see. I lean towards that second category. This isn't to suggest I cannot connect with the cast at all. I enjoy Tanjiro well enough. Nezuko isn't much of a character in my eyes, but she is very adorable, so I'm inclined to let it slide. And Zenitsu sometimes crosses that line from stupidly annoying to actually kind of funny at times. Admittedly mostly because he's voiced by Alex Lee in English, who screams with such genuine ferocity he practically carries the character. But everyone else I'm very much iffy on, because again, I've always felt the majority of them were incredibly one-note in terms of personality. But of course, character writing is only one element of making audiences enjoy your characters. Character growth, or development, or just doing anything unique is another side of the coin. Take Itadori from Jujutsu Kaisen for example. Every arc he is in, it feels like the story is exploring his character and mindset in a different way. In the early arcs, Itadori is largely pushed by his naive but sincere belief in saving people, trying to make a good death meaningful. He is someone simply trying to do the right thing, and is shaken when he realizes he can't always save everyone. In Shibuya, due to the sheer brutality of the situation, he begins to seriously question his existence, especially after when Sukuna uses his body to commit mass murder. By the end of the arc, he considers himself less a hero, more a soldier, considering himself a cog in the larger machine who exists solely to eliminate curses, something that is further explored, complicated, and deconstructed in the Colon Games arc. And because of that, by the Shinjuku Showdown arc, we get a bit of both as he's leaned away from that sense that he's a cog in the machine, moving slightly back towards his bright-eyed self, but still maintaining the lessons he's been taught through the horrors of the things he had seen in Jujutsu Kaisen. And you can say what you want about Jujutsu Kaisen and its handling of Itadori, but at least something new is happening with this character every arc. With Itadori, what we see him go through is incredibly overt. He's evolving, his worldview is altered, things like that. But it doesn't even have to be something that extreme or too obvious, like say Goku in Dragon Ball Z. His outlook, mentality, and overall personality change very little over the course of that half of the series, but putting aside how little he actually is often involved in the events of these arcs, which certainly helps, each arc he is in, especially during their climax, presents a different perspective of his handling of antagonists. With Vegeta, he's concerned about the threat Vegeta poses, but he's also excited by the challenge. We hadn't often seen that element from him before. He wasn't too excited by Piccolo or the other Piccolo, nor with any of the other antagonists before that. By comparison, in the Frieza arc, Goku is calm, confident, cool-headed for much of his screen time, but as his fight with Frieza drags on, and Frieza's overwhelming strength becomes more and more apparent, Goku's confidence is shaken on a consistent basis, and he starts to become more desperate and worried, his intrigue fading as he starts to become desperate to turn this situation around. And once all hope seems lost, he finally loses his composure at his friend's bodies piling around him, a sight which causes him to snap and transform into a Super Saiyan for the very first time, a form which turns him into a colder, more aggressive character than he'd ever been before, a character transformation we hadn't really seen since the OG Piccolo arc, but this time around he was less cocky and more dangerous than before. But then skipping ahead all the way to the latter stages of the Android arc, in the lead up to and during the eventual conflict with Perfect Cell, Goku appears incredibly calm and level-headed despite assessing that he isn't certain that he stands a chance against him, causing the viewer to question why he's so calm about the situation despite his uncertainty, a question answered once he pushes his son into the fight in his place during the final battle. Goku was always the same, but he always feels like he is going through something different due to the varying circumstances. By comparison, I feel with Tanjiro you're kind of getting the same thing every arc. He's a soft boy, protective of others who can get serious when the time calls for it, but other than that, I don't feel any arc largely does much with him to any interesting capacity. And this criticism of mine often extends to other characters in the cast, particularly our main trio of side characters, Nezuko, Inosuke, and Zenitsu. And again, given these characters, at least to me, lack much in the way of good character writing and characterization, the last chance to get me to connect with them would have come from what the story arcs hold with them, and I find that often they're lacking in that area too. There are some moments, but I feel nothing substantial that changes the direction of a story arc. Now, despite all I have to say about that, I don't believe it's the end of the world. In fact, I believe there are several nuances to writing that could possibly make this a non-issue. But in spite of that, I do believe this aspect of Demon Slayer has certainly not helped this story land with me at all. It's with that in mind that I feel the Entertainment District does the best at creating interesting scenarios for our protagonists. For the most part, this arc is more of the same for the main quartet, but things start to get interesting when the conflict begins to heat up. Zenitsu had been next to useless for much of the series, only ever proving himself in brief glimpses when he fell asleep, as it was only in his inability to process danger that he'd been capable of using the strength and capabilities at his disposal. Most of his screen time had been purely comedic, and we hadn't got to see much of the character under circumstances where he'd truly been allowed to lock in. Fortunately, this arc would really deliver on Zenitsu, finally breaking free of his comedic role and indulging in the possibilities of a more serious Zenitsu and what that would bring to the table. Whether that be standing up to Daki and actually being a badass, no strings attached this time. We'd seen glimpses of this here and there, but this is the first time we really get a full arc of locked-in Zenitsu, and I really like that. I really want to say this is the moment he really comes into his own as a character, but unfortunately the only reason he was allowed to get away with any of this was because he was asleep. And don't ask me how he was able to do anything he was able to do in this arc while fast asleep. It's a fucking anime. I don't think it's supposed to make sense, but what it does mean is that none of his actions have any real bearings on his actions in the future. This doesn't reflect development or some change deep in his soul, it's just a character going into a bizarre shift because the plot so demanded it, and that's oh so frustrating, because this arc truly enlightened me to the potential of this character. On the note of Inosuke, we don't really see much of Inosuke that we haven't already seen before in prior story arcs, but I do like the little bits we get to see of him during the build-up before the main battle sequence, because instead of the overly hard-headed animal that he's often portrayed as, we get to see the more composed and intelligent side of the character, something that is only further punctuated by the utilization of his maskless design, which we get to see far more of than we had ever seen before, his soft and somewhat feminine design being in complete contrast to his actual character, and really adding to his brief change in personality. Otherwise though, he fades back into his normal personality once the action gets started, and you know what, I don't mind that at all, especially because the small contrast we got to see before added an extra, if small, layer to the circle that makes up his character. But I feel the best character work comes from the story that is told with Tanjiro and Nezuko, whose characters are both pushed in some of the more interesting directions we'd seen up to this point in the story. I have always enjoyed Tanjiro's presence as a character, due in part because it's really easy to endear me, a huge softie, to soft boy protagonists. An archetype that fits Tanjiro like a glove. Of all the common shonen archetypes, like the dumb motherfucker, the cool guy, the hothead, I think the really swell cinnamon rolls are the ones I'm quickest to gravitate towards, especially if the writer really knows how to play around with the character and create interesting stories with them. It's why I can say a lot about My Hero, a lot not very positive, but I will always defend Deku. But I need to emphasize that it's because of how the writer plays around with the character type. Deku standing up to Bakugo despite his fear of him, Deku fighting for his absolute life with nothing but pure brains, grit, and determination during the sports festival, despite his quirk being next to useless at the time, his anti-hero phase. Things like that always had me at the edge of my seat, and further endeared me to him. But by comparison, I don't really feel like Tanjiro is approached in the way that would really bring out the most interesting storylines. I feel like once he becomes a Demon Slayer proper, we have now been given the complete tour of Tanjiro Kamado. Mugen Train I felt did perhaps the most interesting exploration of his character when he's sent to a dream world where his family is still alive and he's forced to run away from it in order to rejoin the fight against the demon casting the dreams on the train. But once the illusion is broke through, that's it for exploring that guilt he must be holding on to in regards to what happened to his family. I always felt you could always do a lot more with Tanjiro's character, and this was a small glimpse into it. The Entertainment District arc gives us a lot more to chew on, particularly in regards to this forehead form he is given, which acts as a sort of Super Saiyan transformation, which completely turns him into an entirely different character. Tanjiro has never been afraid to get angry when he feels he needs to. He may be a kind young man, but when push comes to shove, he shoves back with determination and desperation to destroy. But it's always primarily out of a means to protect which he loves. Of course, this is exactly why he is transformed, out of love, but he's just so overtaken with pure hatred and disgust that at a point it just stops feeling like Tanjiro. His usual emotional personality disappears into a void of sorts, and in its place is detached, tactical violence. It's as large of a contrast from the usual Tanjiro as you can get, and it's certainly striking. And it's a mystery too, which only makes it much more interesting. And as soon as his transformation wears off, Nezuko undergoes one of her own, which similarly transforms her into a twisted, terrifying version of who she usually should be. Nezuko, as soft and caring as she can be in spite of being a demon, is more than willing to take action in defense of her brother and other humans, hence why we see this transformation in the first place. It's her answer to the challenge Daki poses, a form perfectly capable of not just matching but entirely eclipsing the Upper Moon's strength. And at first, it's this incredibly heroic, badass moment where Nezuko steps in to protect Tanjiro and the rest from Daki's overwhelming power, but as the fight degenerates into a beating where Nezuko mercilessly and gleefully punishes Daki with scary derision, it becomes clear that what we are seeing isn't entirely Nezuko anymore. An assessment proven to be more than correct when she lays eyes on a scared group of women, injured as a result of all the fighting that had gone down in the Entertainment District. And without even thinking at all, Nezuko leaps toward a woman who happened to be bleeding right in front of her to feast on her blood. Mind you, the only reason the Demon Slayer Course had even tolerated Nezuko's existence was purely because she was very clearly attempting to reject the usual demon urge to feed on human blood. The only time she was ever tempted to give in was when somebody literally cut themselves and baited her to try to test her. So to see Nezuko fall so far and so fast, even me, someone who really did not respect Demon Slayer's storytelling much at all, was enthralled by the shift in character, and it raised many questions in my head as to what was happening here and where the story would go with this. Unfortunately, that feels like a rarity in Demon Slayer story arcs. The story arcs often coast by on a predictable formula, not giving much time to properly build into its climax, not giving much time to invest me into its largely so-so characterized characters. And they come out fine, but I always wanted a little more from Demon Slayer because I could always just see that behind its messy storytelling was the potential for something worthy of its popularity and those record-breaking sales. By all means, the stuff I mentioned today could very well be the bare minimum in any other anime, especially those I enjoyed unequivocally. But seeing Demon Slayer finally break free of its limits and compel me ever so briefly, giving me more time to digest the idea its antagonist could be sympathetic, changing up the presentation of its main quartet, that was enough to please me. And while the entertainment arc certainly is not a York New City, Soul Society, Chunin exams, or even Frieza and Android sagas, I imagine this to be a good stepping stone for what was to come in the future. Helps that this arc also did some other great things, such as Uzui, who I felt was not only a very fun character despite being a Hashira, which usually means they'll be depressingly one-note IMO, but the story did a great job building his story arc over the course of the Entertainment District arc. Contrast that with the handling of a character like Rengoku, who, while popular, I had always felt had had his story speed ran when more time over the arc should have been dedicated to making his death more impactful, or Kanroji, whose story arc in the Swordsmith Village arc amounts to little more than just a flashback. Speaking of the Swordsmith Village arc, unfortunately the goodwill Demon Slayer built up from the Entertainment District arc, at least to me, was killed by that arc, as I felt Demon Slayer went right back to its old ways, rushing almost straight into the action, giving us little time to care about what we were seeing, at most giving us a decent story arc with Tokito, but that was kind of it. This arc only reinforced the same structural, character, and emotional problems I have had with Demon Slayer from the very beginning, and made me question whether or not Demon Slayer was ever going to truly resonate with me. It's frustrating because I do like this anime, but I really want to love it. I see the potential this story holds. I see an arc like the Entertainment District arc, and for a moment, I start to think it's finally exiting its perpetual first arc slump. It's easy for many to look past Demon Slayer's shortcomings and embrace it for what it is, a visually stunning, emotionally earnest, action-packed shonen, but for someone like me, who tends to latch onto stronger storytelling and well-planned out character arcs, those messier qualities are impossible to unsee. I will admit, I haven't seen all of Demon Slayer. I'm midway through Season 4 as we speak, and I'm anticipating the eventual movie trilogy covering the final arc. And I have reason to believe it may very well be Demon Slayer's strongest arc, based on the more fleshed out building of the characters that this arc will surround. But even with that aside, what I've seen so far is very much a substantial part of the story that I am not entirely invested in. Even if the Infinite Castle arc proves to be the moment Demon Slayer finally comes into its own in my view, it'll have come far too late in my eyes, and I find that terribly disappointing. Nonetheless, I am looking forward to the Infinity Castle arc, because in spite of all of my issues and all of my criticisms, Demon Slayer is a fun spectacle, and there's never a dull moment when Tanjiro and his squad pull up for a fight. But I do hope more than anything, the Entertainment District arc serves as the stepping stone for a worthwhile final story arc, and undeniable proof that Demon Slayer was more than certainly worth the hype. Yo, sorry for the lack of uploads recently. I've had a little bit of writer's block, basically, but at the same time, I also got a job a couple months back, and that has made it much harder for me to work on videos, but I think I'm getting back into the swing of things, and you can expect a little more content coming soon from me, so yeah, look forward to that. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.